So don't be cute. Be thorough, and like in many cases, verbose variable names is preferable.
Always better. Yeah.
Even if they're weirdly long. If you have a variable called like number of seconds until this thing explodes, that's a totally fine variable name. It's long, but it gets the idea across.
There's no question about what that thing is.
No question.
I would tack on at the end of that in milliseconds, just to be crystal clear.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 425 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam, and I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's July 20th, 20 Jubilee. And before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be swears and curses and hexes on this show.
But also cares.
Lots of cares.
Swearing is caring, We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much for your monthly donations to help us keep this podcast going. All right, you guys. Well, there's a lot of things happening in the world of gaming, in our world, in the studio. We're working on lots of new Crashlands 2 features and starting to kind of like ramp up into a content push. But since we're in the middle of some systems dev, we're not gonna talk about what we're currently working on with Crashlands 2 until it's more solidified. So as a result, we're just gonna do questions. Question getting today.
Let's go.
You guys ready?
Yeah.
How many
All
can
right.
we get? Predictions. I'm going to guess 2.
Let's go.
I'm going for 3. I think
3.
this is gonna be a big one.
It's also going to be a little bit of a
big one.
shorter episode because we're threading some scheduling needles. So
Even
3,
still.
3 is a big...
Okay, let's
Even
go,
still.
boys.
Let's go. All right. Highest upvoted question from podcast.bscotch.net comes from Young Padawan, who says, did you guys read Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin? I was reminded of the Costa Crew a gazillion times while reading it, in a good way. And I was wondering what you all thought about Zevin's approach to writing about the games industry and the creative process. I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on how she depicted university student games and the early career grind.
Okay, now I got to say, Sam's probably thinking the same thing that I am right now, which is, so Seth asked us if any of us read this book before we started the podcast, and we were like,
Yep.
Nope, haven't even heard of it. So then we were like, okay, I guess we probably
We're
won't
like,
be
let's
answering
skip
this
it.
question then.
Yeah.
And
However,
then we're like, oh, how many questions are we going to get on this episode? And Seth's like, we can get 3 in here.
Yep. I fucking snuck that one right in.
We talked about this last week. The metrics you use,
Yeah. Sabotage, subterfuge,
That's true. This is a
backstabbing.
good illustration of the topic of last week. So nice job, Seth. Nice job, Sam, pointing that out. Everybody learned something today.
Now, the reason that I wanted to get this question, not just so that I could win the bet, but which was a huge part of it, but also because so none of us have read this book, so we don't really have anything to say about it. But I just want to say thanks for the recommendation.
Yeah, I read the synopsis and I was like, I probably should read this book. So.
Yeah, it sounds pretty cool. So at least one of us will probably read it, in the coming period of time.
But now this question will already be answered. So I guess.
Yeah, but also this question's been at the top of our list for like a month and a half or something like that, and I just keep skipping it, and I want to get it checked off the list.
Yeah.
So
also consider a nice little, recommendation for people who are listening. Because
it's a fictional novel about game development. And like we've talked a lot about, because like we've been running this podcast since 2015 when the studio was just a few years old at that point. And so we have kind of on archive, on record, some of our own experiences with the kind of early career grind. But we never went to university for game design, but we have worked with universities and we've worked with a lot of students on just how this process works. And Sam and I actually taught at Washington University. We taught a game design course, or actually not a game design course. We kind of taught a game development course.
Yes.
Which is an important distinction. So yeah, I'm curious to see how it's depicted in this book and kind of how that ties into our own experiences.
If the way she depicts student games is that they are largely on teams of too many people and trash, then I'm wrong.
Yeah, the best student games are solo projects. I said it. I stand
Say
by
it again.
All right, let's go on to the next question, which is from QuaavaGittalamp, who says,
Get a lamp.
Hey,
Get a lamp,
What if I
Quava.
don't want a lamp?
yeah.
Well, you need some
We'll get
highlighting,
one.
you know?
I do. I should probably get some more lamps. The ones I have lamps that have remotes right now, but one of the remotes doesn't work, so I have to go physically with my human body go walk over and turn it on. Which
Can't believe you haven't died by now.
I know, this
in,
is
like,
2020.
Stress on your body.
was fucking garbage.
Look,
But also, Adam, it's QuaavaGittalamp, not QuaavaGittalamp if you want one. That's not part of the question
just
here.
a
Just
command.
get one. It doesn't matter if you don't want one. It sounds like you need one, honestly, with a functional remote.
Yeah, that is true.
So Quava says, "Hey Sam, been listening quite a while and find your art journey very interesting to learn about. I've been wanting
Thanks,
to
it's
get
been
back into
painful.
art. Yeah." I've been wanting to get back into art and illustration specifically for a while, but as an out-of-practice artist, I feel a bit lost. Can you recommend any specific art classes or books that helped you move forward?
I talk about this one a lot. I still revisit it whenever I'm a little out of touch with my stuff, which is the Gesture Drawing for Animation collection of essays by Walt Stangefield, which as of a couple years ago is just packaged up very nicely in an actual book instead of like a weird ass PDF you got to go dig around the internet for. That you can get on Amazon for like $20 or something, and it's great. It's not just technical. The way the guy talks is, I would say, it's almost like a spiritual thing, but in a fun way, where it's like, what's the point, really, of putting these lines down? What are you doing?
Yeah, those
You
are
know?
always the best. There's a weird math book I found at a Half Price Books a few years ago that was like written in the 70s by some random professor who I couldn't even find on Google. Right, like just doesn't even exist anymore. Right, but it was like a theoretical math book, but it was just about like how math works. Right. And the guy's personality, he was kind of a dick, to be honest and fair. He was kind of a dick, but he was just like,
Well, it is the 70s.
it is, exactly. It's the 70s. He's an old white dude, right? Like
He's tenured.
not
Who
on
cares?
yeah, presumably tenured. But like the way that it was, like Sam to that same idea, right? It was like when I was reading, it wasn't like a guy was trying to teach me how to do math, right? Or like the way that we all had math books in school. Sentient non-being was trying to teach us math through carefully constructed paragraphs that made sure no person seemed to be involved in the process, right? It was like, it was just this person like exploring the metaphysics of like,
Yeah.
why are we even doing this? What's
Just
even
pop
the
it off
point
about the craft.
Yeah, and
you
it
know?
was like, and I've never learned more about math in my life than like reading the first third of this book. All of a sudden, all these things. It was just things like, he was like, why is this like this? And the answer was always because we decided it was useful if we did it like that. Like that was the answer for all the questions. And it turns out that's how everything else works too. And I was like, oh my God, such a breath of fresh air, you know?
so good. Yeah, I think
Things are
that-
the way they are because somebody decided it was useful at some point. And enough people agreed that that's just how it is now.
Yeah, it's one of those like there are these like weird things of like, oh, 0 factorial. It's like, what is that? And the answer is it's 1, right? And it's like, why though? And it's like, well, if it isn't, it makes a whole bunch of things really inconvenient. It doesn't make it doesn't make logical sense because it can't, right? But
It's
if it
not
isn't,
true.
though, yeah,
It's just useful.
it's just useful. So we decide it's true. Yeah. It's
Well,
just
actually, that's a
fascinating.
very good piece that is also in that animation book. It's not about truth. It's about what he calls capital T truth.
Yeah.
Which essentially comes down to getting what you're trying to get done. But yeah, I think so that book always really good. And then I really enjoy, I know it's not for everybody, but the Ethan Becker, the YouTuber, I think is hilarious. He basically does these fake call out videos where he's like, this person, who's some other YouTuber, fancy Instagram artist, this person's art sucks. Here's why. And then it's actually like, it's basically, he has a microphone attached to a giant hunting knife that he uses.
What?
It's insane. The whole thing's insane, but it's
gotta have a
actually
gimmick.
really good.
Yeah,
It's
I
really
can
good.
see why he's not for everybody based on this depiction.
But he's very fun. And then Sinix, it's Sinix on YouTube is also some of his earlier ones where there's like a shape language and design stuff that are just really fun videos that again give you a way to think about things that aren't just like, here's how a fucking torso works. It's like, no.
Yeah, memorize this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything you can find that isn't just memorize the like, or that doesn't lay things out prescriptively of just say like, here's because I think Sam's also over the years shared various like color theory things like with the team and probably on the podcast and stuff too, right? And then I've seen a whole bunch also for web dev related things, and it's so many of them are just kind of like, here's some approaches to like take it, but it's largely just like, here's how color works, but in this very like prescriptive, like here's the truth kind of a way, right? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until pretty recently when I I started seeing all these like interesting discussions about all these new color mechanisms that are coming to the web. And like new ways of describing colors to give you access to new colors that you couldn't even describe before, like, with like RGB and stuff. And then they're talking about like then they had these discussions of like, well, how do you define a gradient, between one color and another? And I had all these assumptions about like, oh, there's just a way you do these things, right? There's like definitions of these things. But no, there aren't. Like everything is just a debate and a fight about like, well, what does color even mean? Because it's about human perception first, actually. It's not about even reality first. And then how do you match these things up? And then monitors can only see certain colors and print can only see certain colors.
Yeah.
Like,
the thing that fucked me up when I was working with like shaders more with Crashlands 2 and learning more about color through code was when writing converters to convert RGB, which is red, green, blue, 0 to 255, right? So converting that into HSL, which is hue, saturation, luminosity.
Yep.
So luminosity is the brightness, right? And it stands to reason that with RGB color, 255, red, green, blue is white, which is it's the brightest thing that there is, right? And 000 is black, which is the darkest thing that there is. And so a reasonable person would look at that and just be like, oh, like the luminosity must just be like how big those three numbers are.
Yep.
But actually, the luminosity comes like 70-something% just from green.
Yeah, because green is just brighter.
Green is fucking bright, and then the blue is like 7% of the luminosity, and then the red is the remaining 30ish or whatever. And it's like the idea that the luminosity is basically just a measure of, hey, how green is this?
But it's also that even those like that kind of like fraction you came up with, that's not the truth, right?
It's just useful.
That's just a way you can convert RGB to HSL. Or I guess in this case, you're talking about just luminosity, right? But there's a way you can like get the luminosity from an RGB value in a way that feels like it makes sense, right? But there's a whole bunch of other ways to do it too, right?
Yeah.
Because there isn't a truth there. There's just
because there's also HSV, which is very similar to HSL, but the calculation is slightly different because it's useful in another because like color is just about perception, and also like you also don't know whether your perception of colors is the same as other people's.
Well, actually,
there's probably
some not because of color blindness.
There's some variation.
Other stuff.
Yeah, but even like if you're not colorblind and neither is somebody else, you still don't know whether you are seeing.
Yeah, it's the thing that we all did as kids, right? Where you like look at the sky and you're like, do I see the same color blue that you see? It's like,
yep.
And the answer is no, not really.
Yeah, but what does it look like? What is the difference? I don't know. Something else. Now, I have a question about the question. Okay. So the question it was, I've been out of art for a while. I'm out of practice. I'm getting back into it, and I feel a bit lost. So I don't know. What does that mean exactly?
I think it can mean a handful of things on the art side, which is that either when you're returning from having put something like this down for a while and you do have some skills, there's actually just a big question, which is like, again, it's always, what am I doing here? Yeah,
it seems like you'd like kind of get back into it with like for a reason, like with something in mind that you're wanting.
I think you can seek it out more so for the basically as a drive once you get good at it, because since it renders you into a state of flow, and it's fun to make stuff, right?
Yeah.
What you're actually seeking is that, typically, is for me. But that doesn't mean that I know what the fuck to do to.
So instead of coming into it like, oh, I have this project I want to do, it's like, I don't like that I haven't been doing art.
Correct, yeah.
So I'm just going to.
I want to feel that feeling. You know? It's like when you go to the gym without a plan or some shit. It's like you have a want from an emotional drive standpoint that doesn't necessarily have a direct, there's not an obvious just like a thing to do. It's very, I need to pick a thing to do. And the picking is usually where people get stuck. And that's why
I think that's also particularly true depending on where in the curve you left off and how much it's decayed, right? Because when you're a complete noob at something, there's so many resources out there for like, here's the step-by-step guide to like how to like
too many things.
Get to the point where you can actually do at least something that you want to do. And there's too many of them, definitely, but it's still like you can find a starting point, right? Because everything is a starting point, basically. When you're an expert at something, then it's so hard to find anything applicable to what you care about to move your craft further, right? And then there's all like that huge intermediate kind of swath, but that swath in there in particular is exacerbated. It's like the difficulty of it is exacerbated by decay of like the skill set, because if you're coming back to it and you used to know a whole bunch of stuff, but you're not exactly sure like what you're good at and what you're bad at now, right? And you're not really sure anymore like where you fall, because you used to be really familiar with your own knowledge on the topic, right? But now you're not even really aware of like what you do and don't know. And so you simultaneously think you know more than you do, but then when you go try to apply it, you're like, oh, fuck, I actually don't know this. Right. Yeah. And so I can definitely like, I felt this with like other programming languages or other topics where like, I used to know so fucking much about like genetics and because of stuff I got my PhD in. Right. And now I definitely have no idea how much I know anymore. And it's only when I go like interact with that thing again in some capacity where I'm like, oh, this is really familiar, but I don't really remember it. But then I look at something else, I'm like, what the fuck is that? Right. And I'm like, I know that I used to know that, but I thought that I still did, right?
Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say, I wonder how much of it too is like as you get older, I feel like your relationship with knowledge changes. Like you become less confident about stuff that you used to feel like you knew, even if you still quote know that thing, right? Because as you experience more of the world,
on the whole,
you realize how little you know, right? Yeah. And so like I wonder, like in my case, I was really into finance, and that was my my major in college, and I took the CFA exam and passed that and all that. And my courses were all about evaluating companies by looking at their cash flow and their financials and all these different ratios and ways of calculating how inventory and money is flowing through the company, and then like using that information to then judge like if you were to buy shares of this company, what should the share price be, right? And is this company overvalued or undervalued? But and that all seemed very interesting and useful. And as we learned more about it, our professor would kind of come in and just like keep peppering us with this motto of like, no matter what you do, you can't beat the market. As in whatever price you see for a stock or whatever, that price represents the entire investment community's best guess about what that is worth based on all of the publicly available information. Mm-hmm. So you yourself don't have any new information that other people don't have, right? And so
– but also so much of that public evaluation isn't coming from crunching numbers about the company. It's coming from like –
it's just random bullshit.
What do people think about the CEO? What was in the news recently?
Yeah, it's just – yeah, like some company announces something and suddenly the share price drops by 40%, and then the next day it's back up again. It's like, was that company worth 40% less for one day? Yeah. No, like literally nothing changed really, And so, but there was a time where like I believed that there was like as I was learning about finance, like I believed that you could evaluate a company and then come to a decision about whether it was overvalued or undervalued, but the more I learned about it, the more I realized this is all just made up bullshit. And none of it is, it's like in economics when people talked about like if you model economics based on every human being being a rational utility maximizer with perfect information, and then here's what economics looks like. And it's like, yeah, but that's not what people
it's just completely divorced from
reality. It's like the more I learned about it, the more I realized like it's all just extremely loose best guess kinds of things that actually don't really apply to most situations.
Yeah, which I think is,
so I just forgot about all of it.
When you come back to something, after a time, I think you have to recognize that if it's been a while, you've done some other things, and you're arriving as a different person than when you left.
Yeah, you've seen some things.
Yeah, and that means that you might be interested in some things that you weren't interested in, or if you're having trouble grappling with. Because there's a big component to the art thing that isn't present in some of these other components, which is just the manual skill, like literally moving your hand.
Actually rendering the lines.
That sort of thing. And so there's actually a lot of, I think I personally, like I've been revamping as we were going into this kind of big content push that we more or less have started as of like a week ago. I haven't been really on doing a ton of art since literally probably a year and a half ago, because we've just been building the game, like the systems. And so it's just been it's been piece by piece by piece to support enough to build this next system out. And the last time I was able to do this for like actually 40 hours a week, just doing art was, I think, like October to February, basically like 2 years ago, a year or two ago. So I am rusty, and I've been going through this myself. But the thing I always come back to for me personally is basically a few of those things that I know help just sharpen my skills, if that makes sense, that aren't new or hard, which comes down to me for gesture and just like basic form work with people and hands. Because there's like just quick poses. There's a great online thing for that. But just doing like 10 minutes of hand drawings or people, there's just so much cool stuff going on in there. And you could tell if you're wrong. You know, it's not like come up with a new composition of an imaginary creature. Like, no. It's basically this very straightforward practice that you can use to kind of like essentially just get that, reignite the engine a little bit. But you don't have to, it's not like you're embarking on a new fucking huge quest or a new tool or whatever else. But that's also a piece of it that you can use depending on, again, who you are now that you're coming back to it, which is sometimes when I return, the first thing I do is actually do almost like a tools overhaul or revisit. Like Clip Studio Paint's what I use now. And I read the patch notes. Like I go find ways that people are using it, even if I don't necessarily have an application for it. But basically, again, a way of like whetting your appetite for the thing, but without necessarily having to commit to like a project. And people always talk about choosing a project as the way to get back into it. But I think that's a little, depending on where you're at on the lostness, that can be just too much, you know?
I think your idea of like practice something small and easy that supposedly you're already like good at, right? Because you'll be rusty there too if you haven't been doing it for a long time. But I think your point of like, it gets your brain into the right space to then more easily figure out like, so I actually do the same thing. So for programming, like my tool is the keyboard, right?
Yeah.
And if I haven't coded for a while, or if I'm just like feeling like I'm struggling to like make my brain do stuff, I'll just go do some typing practice, right?
Yeah.
Like it's the same thing.
It's the same thing.
Keyboard.com or something, right? And just fucking type and the satisfaction of like, because I've learned how to type fast and well, and I have this mechanical keyboard that feels great, you know, so I'm just slapping these fucking keys, you know? Mm-hmm. And so just like getting into that mode where I'm just like going and typing faster and faster and faster, and then I sit down to actually code, and like there is something that has
100%.
changed, right, about my comfort level with now going and tackling some other stuff just by basically sharpening the tools, right?
Yeah. And I think that's what's really nice about that is that there's no big commitment. You don't have to know anything about what you're doing. It literally is like, you know, if you're a chef, maybe getting out your knives and sharpening them. It's like the same. It's all these things that just kind of put you in the vicinity of the eventual act that you would like to do and sharpen your fluency at the same time, but without any overhead.
Yeah, it's that work your way back up rather than say, oh, it's been so long, and then sit down. Like Sam, your point is exactly right, which is like if you sit down to work on a project that has the same level of like complexity and skill requirements that you left off with, right, then it's just going to suck. But if you can find a way to kind of rapidly work your way back through like the skill set, right, to get to that project, then you'll discover, because on the one hand, like those skills like come back pretty quickly typically, you know, if depending on how long they decay, but even still, like most skills tend to come back pretty quickly once you start repracticing them again. And so that's a good path to do it.
Yeah. And a last thing you can definitely try to do to kind of help reignite stuff is just make sure that you are giving yourself this time and space to do it. If you're just kind of like thinking like, yeah, maybe I'll do some art today. You're not though, right? Like you got to have set aside the time and try to make sure that something, even if it's just like an hour or something here and there, right? Make sure that you've got it slotted, you got a plan for it, and that nothing can interfere with it. Because one of the other things that I think happens when you're trying to get into something or get back into something is you'll hit these roadblocks that something isn't working. Your software needs to update. You can't find some files that
the
like
work
some old
around
stuff.
the work, right?
Yeah, there's all this like administrative shit. And if you don't actually have a committed, you know, like hour or two or whatever, and like you run into one of these things 10 minutes in, it's very easy to just be like, and then just kind of get up and start pacing. And then suddenly you're on your phone and then you're in the next room. And then 3 hours later, you're just like, what? So you need to give yourself the slack and the time to grapple with all the administrative hurdles that just come into all this. So, all right, next question comes from NargatruckeeDippatub.
Is this the third question now? Because
this is the third.
Shit.
Nice.
Seth, you got us.
Yeah. Yep. You know, I rigged it, so it's fine. Yep. Fine for me anyway. So Nargatruckee asks, on which end of the OOP versus functional programming spectrum, OOP being object-oriented programming.
Yeah, this is very in the weeds question.
This is going to be, so we may have to skip this or do an extreme high level.
We could do it. We could make it work.
We could do it.
So, all right. So here's the question. On which end of the OOP versus functional programming spectrum are you? I'm worried that my way of thinking just doesn't seem to fit the OOP paradigm very well. Even after trying to apply it in a few projects. Right now, I'm hobbying on it's a good verb. I'm hobbying on a small game with SDL and FP, and I'm loving it. Don't know what those mean. But sometimes I worry if I'll get into trouble if I try to make more complex stuff without object-oriented programming, given that it's kind of an industry standard, I think. Is this worth worrying about?
I think.
Okay.
So the core question at the very end is just, is this worth worrying about? Which is
So I'm gonna kick this off by saying object-oriented versus functional programming. Nobody listening even needs to know the difference besides to say these are different ways of modeling the world in code. It's just like kind of different fundamental approaches. So all I need to know the details of exactly what also are made. All this is made up.
Yep.
None of this is real. So that's the first thing to always remember is back to the discussion earlier. Why do these paradigms exist for like how to model the world in code? And because at some point somebody found them useful, right? Mm-hmm. And so there are some programming languages that are written for one of these particular approaches. And there's other approaches too, right? But there are some programming languages that are written for some approach. And you might be able to kind of do another approach a little bit, but the language isn't well suited for it. And so it's like really for one thing. So there's over the history of tech and software, like what is dominant ebbs and flows, right? Mm-hmm. And I understand the kind of the question asker's concern about like object-oriented programming seems to be what everybody's doing. It's the industry standard and all this kind of stuff, right? And that's been like the ebb. Actually, which one's the ebb? I don't know. But that's been the high part. That's been what people have been doing, right, for a long time. And there's a reason, which is that object-oriented programming basically says try to mimic the shape of the world in your code. That's basically what it's saying, right? So if there's a thing out in the world, make a thing in your code that's kind of shaped like it somehow, right?
So simple example, let's say you've got shrubs in your game.
Yep.
So you can make a quote object called a shrub. Yep. And an object is just a collection of information. So your shrub might have a bunch of values in it, like how many berries are on it. Berries equals 7. That's a variable in your shrubs.
If I get chopped down, how long does it take me to grow? You know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Regrow time equals 29 seconds, whatever, right? So like these are all things that can be there in the shrub object, right? And so it's all nicely compartmentalized in one place. And then if somebody wants to be like, what's going on with shrubs in this fucking game? I can't figure shrubs out. And they can just search for the shrub. They can just search for the word shrub. They will find the shrub object and all of the information about how shrubs work.
It all works. And
it's just all in there, right? So it's kind of like a nice way of kind of packaging up bundles of information into one spot. So.
And the nice thing about like embracing a particular paradigm is that people over the years have fought long and hard to find good ways of doing things that are otherwise really tricky, right? And so these are what we call design patterns in programming and presumably elsewhere, right? Is like, again, none of these are true. None of these are real. None of these are the way you're supposed to do stuff, right?
Useful ways of
thinking. They're just useful things that people have figured out. So when I'm coming to programming, I don't give a shit. That's the kind of short answer about whether I'm writing functional or object-oriented programming, whether I know all of the things and so on. The reason I care at all is because those are all useful tools to be aware of. That's why I even know what these terms mean, right? That's why I've read books about various ones. And that's I think where the value is if you know enough about these things to understand like how people use these approaches to solve problems and why they're useful, then you're basically just expanding your toolkit. But if you fall into these dogmatically, where you say like, should be functional, should be object-oriented, should be whatever paradigm you want, then that's where you're being prescriptive, right?
Yeah, it just doesn't matter.
It just doesn't. It doesn't actually matter because the thing that because like the question asker said, which is why like how it was framed was, I'm having trouble figuring out how to like use object-oriented programming to solve these problems that I'm solving, right? Then that means that's not a good. that means it's not a good toolkit for you. And this is something like when I'm reviewing other people's code, when I'm like trying to figure out what advice to give or like what suggestions to give. then I try to focus on what they need for their brain. And I might also give some commentary about what I would like to see, but I also try to couch that in terms of, but the reason that I would do it that way is because the way that my brain works would make this much easier for me to navigate, right?
Because you're accustomed to a certain set of design paradigms.
Yeah. So if you're working with other people, that's when the decisions matter. But that's a collaborative question, not let's do this paradigm or let's do that paradigm. The question is, what the hell are you trying to do? And why are those useful tools to use for solving your problems?
Yeah, I think there's basically a question of, are you talking about fundamental skills or fundamental philosophies that underscore every approach? If you're talking clean code practices, right? Whatever. Or are you talking about a higher level collection of design patterns like object-oriented programming, whatever else, that essentially are a way of going about executing on top of those foundational approaches that are better served for certain models? And then I think the final question, because of the end, what was the end question? Should I be worried about this?
It is, just is this worth worrying about?
Yeah, I think the answer is no, if you are able to deliver on what you're trying to do, given your current skill set. If you're not able to deliver on what you're trying to do, then it might be because you're missing a pattern. You might be in a space where it actually would make sense for using object-oriented code or whatever else. And so the reality is, like, you can make really like janky products that do extremely well. I mean, look at Crashlands. You know what I mean?
Yeah. If you want to talk about programming paradigms, I don't think there is one that applies to Crashlands. It's just a pile of variables.
So the stick I always use is just, does it help me get this project over the finish line more efficiently? And then also, maintain it if it's the maintainable.
Yeah, well, I think that's where this really comes in, I think, is so I would basically agree with all of that, with the slight difference of, like, should I worry about it? I think in the sense that the question asker is asking, Sam, I think you're right. No is the answer, right? Unless you're having trouble. But I think with a different kind of tint on the question, the answer is yes, which is basically like, should I care about the differences, right? And the answer is yes, like, because this is a toolkit question. This is, and I will very freely admit that I still struggle with some of the core concepts that are just classic object-oriented design patterns. Mostly because they're named so fucking horribly that I can't, my brain just slips right off of them while I'm trying to figure out how they work, right? And so that means I don't use those, right? Because I can't figure out quite how to think about them and use them in my toolkit. But once a year, I take one of those things that I couldn't figure out before and I go see if I can figure it out this time, right? And that's just been true for every design pattern I've ever run into in code. And so I try to see other design patterns all the time. But I don't worry if I don't get it. I just kind of file it away and I'm like, okay, I don't understand this right now. I can't tell if this would be useful. I'm going to revisit this some other time, right? And if you approach things that way, and this is true for any discipline, right? Then just over time, you keep on expanding your ability to do things, because what you will find is that there are reasons that these design patterns are well established. And it's because they're extremely useful for solving certain kinds of problems. But until you're really familiar with them, you can't use them to solve your problems. They actually just make your life more difficult instead.
Yeah.
But you do want to, over the years of you practicing some craft, be able to add more and more of those things to your toolkit, because then you can just do more stuff. And in particular, I guess we can all attest for we're just joking about how Crashlands is a mess, right?
Yeah.
Maintainability, holy shit. Okay, that's the hardest problem, because when the fewer tools you have available, the wonkier your solutions have to be. Yeah. Right? That's true. Like Sam said, if you can get it done though, that's always the most important thing, right? Mm-hmm. Most things that get done don't ever need to be maintained.
Yeah. Yeah, because most things don't go anywhere. They just go into the archives in your folders. It's like, well, that was a fun prototype to make.
And so the kind of maintenance thing is actually just in your own brain, and then that's great, right? Some things do need to be maintained, but the reality is still that it doesn't matter that it would have been better for maintainability in the long term to do something a certain way if you didn't know how to do it that way, right? Because you couldn't have done that. And even if you did try, you would have just slowed yourself down. You would have done less. You would have had a worse outcome, actually. And so the most important thing, as always, is to always be stretching and trying to figure out how to incorporate new tools and techniques into whatever your practice is. But don't do it dogmatically ever. And even if somebody says this, even if you believe when someone's like, this is the way to do it, you're looking at it, you're like, oh, I can see how that's true. If you can't figure out how to do it, that's still fine. Try again later. Just
But
keep
I think
moving on
there's-
the things you do know.
And there's one thing to worry about though, which is your code clean and
Yeah.
readable?
Yep.
Because
And these patterns help with that, but that's still that's a different question though. Yep.
Yeah, and like as somebody who's been programming primarily in Game Maker for more than a decade, I don't know C++, for example. But the question is, can I read C++? Well, sometimes, it depends. It depends on like if I see somebody else's code and it's in C++, if it's clean, if variables have understandable names, whatever, then I can pretty quickly and easily piece together what's going on in that code, and I would be able to make some edits or do some work on it and figure it out, right? But if, for example, whenever you like use time, you just use like T, and whenever you use like enemies, you just use E or something, then like
Or if you're
pretty soon-
using some of these complex design patterns that you just have to know,
Yeah.
like because that's what I would agree with that completely. Like because I call it being cute or clever, right? Is when you just take some really cool design pattern that might be extremely effective for like what the thing you're trying to accomplish, but it also can make it so when you come back to that thing or somebody who's not familiar with that design pattern comes to that thing, they just cannot figure out what the fuck is happening. Yep.
Yeah. So don't be cute, be thorough, and like in many cases, verbose variable names is preferable.
Always better. Yep.
Even if they're weirdly long, if you have a variable called like number of seconds until this thing explodes, that's a totally fine variable name. It's long, but it gets the idea across.
There's no question about what that thing is.
No question.
I would tack on at the end of that in milliseconds just to be crystal clear.
Yeah. So definitely check out the book Clean Code for more info on that. Unfortunately, that's all. We got to cut this episode a little bit short. We have all kinds of scheduling chaos happening today, so we aren't able to get the last little bit in here. But yeah, we got 3 questions in, so that's I call that a win.
Good work, team.
All right. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Also, be sure to head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. Things are popping off since we had a daily deal on Steam with Crashlands, so
just wish it's pouring in.
It's moving. Yeah,
but not so much that we don't need your help. So please,
hop on over there, give Crashlands 2 a wish list. We'd appreciate it, and helps juice up the algorithms. So thank you all very much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.